For a cold-blooded killer, sometimes the safest place to hide is in plain sight. Martin McNeill used his expertise as a doctor to take a life, and then put on a performance in his 911 call that convinced almost everyone of his innocence. Only unluckily for him, not everyone was fooled by this murderous conman.
We have a police department for medical account. Okay, what's the problem, sir? Lee Medical. Sir, what's wrong?
I'm falling in the bathtub.
Who's in the bathtub? Who's in the bathtub?
My wife.
Okay, is she conscious?
She's not. She's not on a position.
Okay, sir, I need you to calm. Sir, I can't understand you, okay? Can you calm down just a little bit? Okay, your wife is unconscious?
She is unconscious. She's underwater.
Okay, did you get her out of the water?
I can't. I couldn't start. I let the water out. She's not in progress.
She's under the water?
She's out of the water. I was wondering if we could get an ambulance.
Okay, is she breathing at all?
She is not.
Okay, sir, the ambulance has been paged. They're on their way, okay? Do not hang up. What? Sir? Why would an adult female be so...
Hello?
Sir, this is 911. Can I help you?
I need help.
Okay, sir, they're on their way. Is your wife breathing?
She is not. I am a physician. I got CPR in progress.
You're doing CPR. Do you know?
Oh, no,
Sir, how old is your wife?
my wife is 50 years old. She just had surgery here a couple of days or a week ago.
What kind of surgery did she have?
She had a facelift.
She had a facelift?
Yes.
Okay, do you know how to do CPR?
I'm doing it.
Okay, do not hang...
April 11th, 2007, Pleasant Grove, Utah. Police arrived on the scene to find Michelle McNeill dead in the bathtub. Her death was ruled as accidental, but despite the desperation in her husband Martin's voice during his 911 call, the sight of his wife unresponsive under the water was almost certainly not a shock to the accomplished doctor. Martin McNeill had gotten away with a perfect crime. No fingers were being pointed in his direction, but perhaps in his newfound confidence, supported by a feeling of being above the law, McNeill was about to leave a trail of destruction that would eventually lead back to the death of his wife. Martin McNeill was something of a jack of all trades, or better yet, a master of disguise. He began to spin his web of lies all the way back in the 1970s. In 1976, just 4 months after marrying Michelle, Martin McNeill was arrested and charged with forgery, fraud, and theft. The calculating con man served 6 months in prison and then tricked his way into medical school with falsified documents, inflated grades, and an unmistakable talent for manipulation. McNeill would then use the same tactics to enter law school. It is these two professions that Martin would use in later life to prop himself up in conversations. Those that knew him described him as arrogant and stated that he often insisted on informing people that he was both a lawyer and a doctor. By 2007, Martin was a certified success, a practicing physician in Utah with a loving wife and 8 children, 4 of which were adopted from Ukraine. By this point, Martin had a long history of telling lies, but his deceit remained buried from his children and the community. Michelle, on the other hand, had begun to suspect her husband was having an affair. She was right, but she certainly couldn't have imagined that Martin was not just having an affair. He was having 2 of them. The first was with Anna Osborne Walthall, the other with Gypsy Willis. McNeill had met Willis in an online chat room. The woman was immediately taken in by Martin's charm and intelligence, and the two began what would become a long-term secret relationship. This doesn't mean that Martin kept Gypsy hidden, though. In fact, he did the opposite. After first allowing his forbidden lover to attend Michelle's funeral, Martin then made an even more shocking move by bringing Gypsy Willis into the family home as a leave-in nanny. In 2009, 2 years after Michelle's death, Martin and Gypsy were convicted of fraud for using one of McNeill's adopted daughter's social security numbers in an attempt to help Willis escape her debts. This was yet another lie exposed, and it seemed that Martin McNeill had finally pushed his luck too far. As prompted by his latest crimes, investigators reopened the case of Michelle McNeill's death. Martin had gotten away with murder, but his own arrogance had now cost him. McNeill never expected his own children to look to him as the one guilty for their mother's demise, but by 2012, the McNeill family were ready to testify against their father. A new toxicology report on Michelle's death was requested, as days before her passing, Martin's longtime wife had been prescribed numerous medications after having a facelift. This facial surgery just happened to be Martin's idea and was only suggested after he was confronted by Michelle about having an affair. Michelle allegedly agreed to the surgery in a desperate attempt to save her marriage. She would be in safe hands under the knife after all, but what she didn't count on was her husband slipping the surgeon a list of medications he wanted his wife to be prescribed. These were no ordinary post-plastic surgery pills. Martin McNeill, the con man and crook, had devised a cocktail of death for his own spouse. For the days that followed the facelift, Michelle was often drowsy, slow to react, and spent most of her daylight hours in bed. Michelle was so out of it that when daughter Alexis attempted to wake her up, she did not respond. When Alexis alerted her father to the situation, Martin McNeill offered up a chillingly calm explanation. Michelle had simply taken too much of her medication. After further questioning from Alexis, Martin confessed that he had given Michelle some extra doses as she had recently thrown up. Even if Michelle had begun to distrust her medically qualified husband at this point, she had no idea what pills she was being given because she was still wearing eye patches for recovery after the cosmetic surgery. The following day, Michelle was found dead in the bathtub. After Martin McNeill made his 911 call, he reached out to his daughter Alexis, and their conversation is one that she will never forget. He said, "Your mom, she's in the tub. She's not breathing. I've called an ambulance." And then he hung up. I just started driving to the airport and I was just screaming. He killed her. That was my first instinct. The young woman immediately suspected foul play, and so she planned to count how much of Michelle's medication was left over in an attempt to calculate just how much her dad had forced her to take. By the time Alexis or even law enforcement arrived at the home, all the pills had conveniently, for Martin at least, been flushed down the toilet. The evidence had been washed away, but Alexis had figured out her dad's plan. Yet though it was far from foolproof, the police believed Martin's story. Michelle's death was ruled accidental and the case was closed just 2 months later. Alexis did not give up though. She had a killer to catch. And even though it was her own father, she began a relentless pursuit of the truth. After being turned down by newspapers, reporters, and private investigators, Alexis finally got someone to take another look at her mom's death. Martin McNeill was already in prison at this point in time after he was caught along with Gypsy, attempting to con the state with falsified social security documents. Martin McNeill was released in July of 2012, but thanks to Alexis, Martin was soon back in police custody.
In October of 2013, Martin McNeill finally went on trial for the murder of Michelle McNeill. Less than a month later, Martin McNeill was found guilty of murder and obstruction of justice and sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. To make the story of this doctor-turned-devil even more sickening, Martin McNeill went on trial again the following year, this time for sexually abusing his own daughter. The man that encapsulated evil with such heinous acts against his own family members spent the next 2.5 years behind bars before putting all this horror to an end by taking his own life in 2017. With Martin McNeill's death comes closure for the family he leaves behind. Today, Alexis and her siblings all do their best to honor and remember their mother whilst erasing all traces of their father. Even Michelle's gravestone, which once read "Wife of Martin," has been sanded down to remove any mention of the man who murdered her. Martin's former mistress, Gypsy Willis, was not found to have played any part in Michelle's death. She claims to have known nothing about Martin's alleged plan and even goes as far as to say that she believes Martin McNeill to be innocent. An important part of Martin McNeill's plan was likely his 911 phone call. Though he played the part of a grieving husband well, it was only a matter of time before the truth about this sickening act came to light.